Professor Lawrence M. Krauss is Ambrose Swayze a professor of physics, professor of astronomy, and chair of the physics department at Case Western Reserve University. He's an internationally known theoretical physicist with wide research interests, including the interface between elementary particle physics and cosmology, where his studies include the early universe, the nature of dark matter, general relativity, and neutrino astrophysics. He received his Ph.D. in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in 1982, then joined the Harvard Society of Fellows. In 1985, he joined the Faculty of Physics at Yale University and moved to take his current appointment in 1993 as a Fellow of the American Physical Society and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Professor Krauss is the author of over 180 scientific publications, as well as numerous popular articles on physics and astronomy. In addition, listen to this now, he's the author of 6 popular books, including the national bestseller, The Physics of Star Trek, and his most recent book, Atom, An Odyssey from the Big Bang to Life on Earth and Beyond. He is the recipient of numerous awards for his research, writing, and lecturing. These include the Presidential Investigator Award given by President Reagan in 1986, the American Association for the Advancement of Science's 1999-2000 Award for Public Understanding of Science and Technology, joining previous awardees, Carl Sagan, Edward O. Wilson, and the 2001 Andrew Gaumont Award, given annually to a person who's made significant contribution to the cultural, artistic, or humanistic dimensions of physics. Previous awardees include Freeman Dyson, Steven Weinberg, and Stephen Hawking. In 2002, Krauss was awarded the American Institute of Physics, Science, and Writing Award for his book, Atom. Professor, welcome to the program.
Well, it's nice to be here.
I understand you're here under somewhat unusual circumstances over on your end, huh?
Yes. It's every time I hear the lightning, it makes it very appropriate because I'm here in the dark. I'm at the University of California right now, and all of the power is out because of a fire. But remarkably, the phones still work.
The phones work. So, in other words, you're sitting at the university in pitch blackness?
You got it.
When did that occur?
About an hour and a half ago.
Where is the fire?
I phoned the police. It's somewhere in a parking lot. But somehow that seems to affect the power at the university, or maybe they turn it out for safety reasons.
At any rate, you're not in imminent danger of turning into a French fry.
If you hear me scream and run away. I don't think so.
All right, good. Well, then it'll give you a nice, relaxed atmosphere to sit there and just sort of tell us everything you know in.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right. Professor, it's rare indeed and an honor to get somebody on the air with your kind of credentials, and so I've got a lot of very interesting questions for you, beginning with time. For me, personally, time travel has always been probably, the most intriguing thing I could even consider doing if I had anything I named that I wanted to do before my life ended. Traveling in time definitely would be up there at the head of the list.
Sure. Well, you're not alone. I think everyone would love to go back in time and either correct the errors of their youth or relive them, depending on their mood.
Huh. I'm actually not sure that would be what I would do.
You go back and meet your favorite heroes from history?
The possibilities are absolutely endless, actually. So we've got a lot to talk about. In your opinion, is time travel ever going to be possible in either direction?
Well, what is fascinating about time travel, and it truly is fascinating, I mean, everyone's excited by the prospects, is that given the laws of physics as we now understand them, we cannot say it's impossible. And that alone is a remarkable statement, because there are lots of... the minute you allow for time travel, you produce a host of paradoxes, the most famous being the grandmother paradox. What happens if you go back in time and kill your grandmother before your mother was born? Well, then, of course, you couldn't exist, right? But if you couldn't exist, how did you go back in time and kill your grandmother? And it's that, would give you a headache if you think about it long enough, and it gives physicists headaches, and so that's one of the many reasons why many physicists have presumed that a sensible universe shouldn't allow time travel. In fact, Stephen Hawking was when the physics of Star Trek came out, it actually caused a big stir in England because Stephen had come out and said time travel is impossible earlier, and then in the foreword for that book, and as I argued in that book, given the laws of physics as we now understand them, you couldn't say it was impossible. And the London Times had a front-page story saying Stephen Hawking changes his mind. He actually gave a very good argument for why he thought time travel was impossible.
Why did he thought it was impossible because of what you just described, because of the paradox?
Well, actually, he even said something more that maybe resonate with your listeners even more. He said, if time travel were possible, we'd already be inundated by tourists from the future.
Where are the time travelers, right?
Exactly. Of course, I countered him by saying they all went back to the 1960s and no one noticed. But but in any case, there are many questions, and so if you're going to allow for universal time travel, you have to try and address those things. But the law, general relativity, as a theory, allows in principle for time travel. However, we know that in order for time travel to occur, then there must be very exotic types of energy that you have to be able to create, totally different than anything we know of normally on Earth or in stars, because in fact relativity tells us that space and time in fact respond to the presence of matter and energy. Mm-hmm. That's the aspect that space curves in the presence of matter. And time and clocks change the rate at which they tick in the presence of matter. In fact, a clock on the first floor of a building actually ticks at a slightly different rate than a clock at the top floor. That was one of the predictions of general relativity. It's a very, very small difference, but in fact it was measured in the 1940s and 50s for the first time with atomic clocks.
What about with respect to motion? Those are two clocks that are not in relative motion. However, I understand they've taken two clocks and put them on jet planes going in opposite directions and measured a pretty significant difference.
Well, a measurable difference. I don't know. You'd say pretty significant. You would notice it on your watch at home, but atomic clocks you can measure. Yes, indeed, clocks. That was one of the first predictions of special relativity, and in fact, it's not a science fiction thing at all. We can measure it in undergraduate physics laboratories every single day.
Okay, let me stop you and just ask. Would the two clocks you described, one on the bottom floor and one on the top floor, would the delta or the difference be greater with two jet planes going in the opposite direction? If so, why?
Well, they're both very small. They're both about less than a part in a million in terms of the change, so that when one clock ticks a second, another clock is going to tick 1 second plus a millionth of a second.
Yes.
They're extremely small because you have, in order to get measurable time differences, significant, you either have to be traveling at very close to the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second, far faster than any jet planes, or you have to be in a gravitational field that's so strong, that it would kill you before.
Like a black hole.
Like a black hole.
But again, going back to my question, the clock in the top of the building versus the one on the first floor and the two airplanes, would there be a difference between those two measurements of difference? Would the jet planes achieve a slightly greater difference?
I actually think the jet planes traveling as they are at only maybe 600 miles per hour would actually have a smaller difference than
really?
Clocks, yeah.
Really?
Yes, because the actual the relative difference is actually related to the velocity of the plane over the velocity of light squared, and that's a very small number. Light is it goes very fast. It 186,000 miles a second is pretty darn fast. That's 2 seconds to the moon and back, basically, and a jet plane at 600 miles per hour is much slower, and the square of that is very small. So that's why, in fact, it took a while before that hypothesis of Einstein's was directly verified. But now it's amazing. We can verify. In fact, anyone and I imagine among your listeners, there may be some people who indeed have Geiger counters.
Oh, yes.
We were just talking about radiation early on.
I have one. Yes.
And if you turn your Geiger counter on and move away from your walls. Of course, there's radiation coming from walls and people and everything else. But if you go out in the middle of a field and turn your Geiger counter on, it will click. And one of the reasons it clicks is that there are cosmic rays coming from outer space that hit the atmosphere of the Earth and produce lots of charged particles that come down and make your Geiger counter click.
Professor, mine clicks inside. Every now and then I get a click from it. Now, should that be, or should the roof be stopping this?
Well, in fact, the roof does not stop some of these very energetic particles. In fact, there's one type of particle, an elementary particle called a muon, which is a lot like an electron, but about 100 times heavier, that makes it generally not just through your roof of your house, but actually deep underground before it actually stops. And the interesting thing about muons is we can create them in elementary particle accelerators on Earth, and we do it all the time. And we know exactly how long they live. They're actually unstable particles. They live 1/1,000,000th of a second on average, about 1/1,000,000th of a second. But we can measure that. Now, the interesting thing is these objects are created about 10 miles up at the top of the atmosphere when cosmic rays bang into the atmosphere.
Yes.
Now, you can calculate a particle traveling very close to the speed of light in 1/1,000,000th of a second will actually travel much less than 10 miles. Okay, it will travel probably only a few hundred yards, or maybe less than a mile. But these things make it all the way down to the Earth. How is that possible? Well, in fact, because they're going so fast, their internal clocks are ticking slowly, and they don't know they should decay. And so they make it down to the Earth. And so almost every time your Geiger counter clicks, you're proving special relativity.
No kidding.
Yeah, because literally those particles, it's what we call time dilation. Their lifetime, when they're moving very fast, is much longer than their lifetime when they're standing still, precisely because their internal clocks are slowed down.
So these particles should decay. I mean, in the world of physics, they should decay, but explain to me what you mean by they don't know they should decay and they're going so quickly.
Okay, what Einstein told us, let's take it back to something that's a little more personal, you in a spaceship, okay? Einstein told us that if you travel out in a spaceship and you're going very close to the speed of light, that if I'm watching you, your clocks appear to be slow compared to mine. So when my clock ticks, goes for an hour, your clock may only tick for a second. Okay? That's what it looked like. It looked to me like, your clock is running very slowly. My clock has clicked 3,600 seconds, and yours has only clicked 1. There's something wrong with your clock. But what it really means is, in fact, that time is relative. That in your frame, for example, if you went to the center of the galaxy, which is about 40,000 light years away, and very close to the speed of light, if I were watching you, it'd take 40,000 years. Okay? It'd be pretty boring. But it'd take 40,000 years for you to get there. But in your frame, if you're traveling very fast, that whole trip could just take 2 weeks. And it really would. It's not science fiction. If you were traveling close enough to the speed of light,
yes,
that trip for you would literally just take 2 weeks. And whereas obviously for someone on the ground or a civilization on the ground would take 40,000 years. And so it's absolutely true that that's what would happen. And so for these muon.
So in other words, let me get this straight. You could take a 2-week trip, and now you're back, and 40,000 years have elapsed.
Yes.
On Earth.
Yes.
But you have only grown 2 weeks older. 2 weeks older.
Absolutely. That's the gist. That's been used by many science fiction writers for lots of good stories. Planet of the Apes, lots of famous science fiction stories are based on that idea. But it's not science fiction. It's really true. Of course, you have to be traveling very, very, very close to the speed of light in order to do that. And there's the rub, because to travel very, very close to the speed of light requires unbelievable amounts of energy. Einstein also, unfortunately, told us that the faster you're going, the closer you're getting to the speed of light, as you get closer and closer, not only do your clock slow down, but something else happens.
What?
You act like you're heavier and heavier. Okay, your mass actually appears to increase. And again, we measure that for elementary particles. Those muons, when they're traveling very, very close to the speed of light, act much heavier than muons that are at rest.
But, Professor, wouldn't it be possible, for example, with an atomic rocket, to build toward the speed of light, come pretty doggone close to the speed of light in continued acceleration?
Well, in fact, it's not impossible, but it would be very difficult. In fact, in the physics of Star Trek, I actually did a calculation that kind of surprised me. Even if we had fusion reactors, which we don't have on Earth,
right?
But fusion is the stuff that powers the process that powers the sun,
yes,
and thermonuclear weapons. It's obviously, as my friends at Los Alamos like to say, you get more bang for your buck from a fusion reaction than a simple explosion.
Yeah.
1 million times more power. So we can't control fusion right now. We have uncontrolled explosion. But let's imagine we had a fusion reactor and we used it to power a spacecraft. Well, every time you wanted to just do the following simple maneuver, start out at rest, go to, say, just half the speed of light, not 99% of the speed of light, but just half the speed of light.
Okay.
And stop again. Every time we want to just start, go to half the speed of light and stop.
Stopping is as much trouble as starting, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every time you did that, you would need to find 7,000 times the mass of the spacecraft in fuel. And that's if you had a fusion reactor. Okay?
Wow.
If you used the conventional rocket fuel, I did a calculation which even amazed me, to take a single atom and accelerate it using conventional rocket fuel to half the speed of light would require more fuel than there is mass in the entire visible universe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, I mean, while we like to talk about this, it's not easy, because even if we had fusion, you'd have to take 7,000 times the mass of the ship every time you wanted to start and stop, if you powered the ship with fuel on board. And we can talk about that later. One of the ways around this may be not to carry the fuel with you, but be powered from somewhere else. Even if you used matter and antimatter, which are which give you the most bang for the buck in the universe, when antimatter exists in nature, and when a particle of matter encounters a particle of antimatter, the two annihilate, producing pure radiation, and that turns mass into energy with 100% efficiency, and you can never do better than that. Even if you did that, the amount of fuel required would be amazing.
Well, yeah, but a jet aircraft, for example, operating within the atmosphere, takes in air and blows it out real quick, right?
Yeah.
That's what a jet does. So why not imagine some sort of craft that takes in dark matter and spits it out real fast?
Well, real fast is the issue. The point is that a jet aircraft cannot travel a lot faster than the air that it spits out. Okay?
Right.
And in a fusion reaction, for example, the constituents after the reaction are moving about 3% of the speed of light.
Okay? Gotcha.
And so if you want to move faster than 3% of the speed of light,
then you need to spit faster.
Well, exactly. You need to spit faster. And, of course, the fastest you can spit is spitting things out at the speed of light. So like shining a laser beam.
Sure.
So in principle, you'd say, okay, well, let's just shine a laser beam behind us and we'll start speeding up. And the point is you will, but it takes a long time because light, doesn't carry a lot of oomph. And so eventually, it's the most efficient way of going fast.
Light?
Just shining light.
When you hear a little beep, if you can hear it, a little tiny beep here. Let's see if you can hear one. Of course, when you want one, it never comes. There's one. I've got a Geiger counter here, and that beep you hear is the occasional little particle that comes crashing down. There was another one. You heard them two in a row. So if you have a sensitive Geiger counter, you can do that. Pretty strange sitting here and listening to that and knowing where it's coming from and how it made it here and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it's one of those fascinating things that it's nice to see a simple demonstration of such an exotic piece of physics.
Yes, and of course, these are handy little instruments to have around just in case of, I don't know, whatever might happen these days, huh?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So time travel then, it seems to me like the bottom line of all this is, you're saying, maybe it is possible with enough power. Well, yes, we haven't even, the kind of effects we've been talking about, clocks slowing down and speeding up, yes, are exotic and in fact require lots of power, but they're not. But they still don't address your original question. They don't allow time travel backwards. They just mean that different people in different places can have their clocks move forward at a different rate. But to actually go backwards in time is even more exotic,
And that not only requires lots of energy, but energy of a totally different type. It turns out that just speeding up or slowing down isn't good enough.
Okay.
You need something far more exotic, something that has what's called negative energy, in fact. And it's right now it's to some extent the stuff of science fiction. People have proposed, given general relativity, weird things called wormholes and shortcuts through space-time that might allow you to create a time machine, but in order to build these objects and actually use them, you'd have to have something that was gravitationally repulsive. And as all of your listeners know who's taken physics, gravity sucks. It tends to always pull. It never pushes. Mm-hmm. And in order to build a time machine, you'd have to have something that's gravitationally repulsive. We know that in general relativity. And the question is such material possible to create and build and use? We don't know the answer.
Gravitationally repulsive. All right, fine. Why does that allow time travel in reverse?
Well, let's see. Well, in order to explain that, I'd have to give you an example of a time machine, which I'm happy to do if you want to work with me here.
I'm working with you.
Okay. So one good example of a time machine is something called a wormhole, which is sort of like a shortcut through space in the following way. Imagine a sort of a balloon.
A la Jodie Foster.
Exactly, a la Jodie Foster in Contact, exactly. Yeah. But the idea is general relativity says, well, space can be curved, right? So imagine a curved balloon. And if you were an ant living on that curved balloon, if you wanted to go from one end of the balloon to the other, you'd have to walk around the balloon, right?
Right.
Okay. Unless you're an intelligent ant who's taken general relativity. And then, if you push down in the balloon, if you produce a lot of curvature in one place, and you push down in the opposite hemisphere, you push really hard, those 2 points can meet, and you can cut a little hole and sew it together and make a little tunnel, literally a shortcut from one place to another.
I've come to observe, Professor, that people of your sort work with ants a lot in analogies. They really have a lot of
they're oldies but goodies. What can I say? In any case, that two-dimensional wormhole is sort of an analogy to what might exist in principle in the real universe. If you put a lot of energy and matter in one place, you'd curve space tremendously. And if you might imagine somewhere ostensibly very far away, a similar thing happens, and somehow this shortcut connects these two places, like Jodie Foster's wormhole in Contact. Yeah. Now, it sounds nice. Now, the question is, could you actually build a wormhole? Well, the answer is we know you cannot if normal matter and energy are all there is. In fact, calculations have been done to show that the problem is if you put a lot of matter and energy in one place, it's gravitationally attractive, and it will collapse to form a black hole. We know that. As gravitation, it will collapse, okay? And we can prove that at either end of the wormhole, the mouth of the wormhole will collapse into a black hole out of which nothing can escape in a time shorter than it takes to go through the wormhole. So there are no traversable wormholes in nature unless you have gravitationally repulsive material. Well, if you had that, you could fill the wormhole up with that kind of energy, and it would hold the mouth of the wormhole open. So you could create stable wormholes if you had gravitationally repulsive material. Now, what does all this have to do with time travel? Well, it turns out if you had a wormhole, you could have a time machine if you had a traversable wormhole. And here's the way. It's going to sound like a used car salesman, so just bear with me here. If you're at one end of the wormhole and you're just sitting there, okay,
yes,
and you have a friend at the other end of the wormhole on the other side of the galaxy somewhere, okay, and you look at a telescope with a telescope and you see her there at the other end of the wormhole, okay?
Right.
But her end of the wormhole is moving very fast. Say it's doing a big circle, say 5 light years around.
Okay.
Pretty quickly. And let's say that end of the wormhole is moving at near the speed of light, so it takes her 5 years to go around in that big circle, okay?
Right.
So you watch her. It takes 5 years for her to do that. Of course, she's at the end of the wormhole moving through space very fast, so her clock is traveling slowly.
Right.
So for her, that takes, let's say, 1 week. So now she is 5 years minus 1 week behind you in time.
Uh-huh.
And if all you have to do is walk through the wormhole and you come out the other end and you're 5 years earlier. And so the idea is if you had stable wormholes, you could in principle have a time machine. But as you can see, the problem is we know you cannot have stable wormholes with normal matter and energy. We know it. It's been proved mathematically. There's no doubt. So if you want to do it, you have to come up with some weird, very weird kind of energy, which is not like anything we create on Earth. And we don't know.
Yes. I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Is the creation I've heard rumors, Professor, that there are people like yourself working on the actual creation of a black hole, or
a baby universe or wormhole.
Yeah, or even a sort of a replication of what they think might be the Big Bang and all that sort of exotic sort of stuff. Now, if they would have sudden success with this and they would create a stable. First of all, is it a really good idea to be trying that stuff?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of that is hype in the sense that we use those words to try and explain to people what we're trying to do and make it seem interesting. In elementary particle physics accelerators, we are in a sense trying to recreate conditions that were very similar to the conditions in the earliest moments of the Big Bang explosion.
Mm-hmm.
But it's wrong to say we're trying to recreate the Big Bang, because we're not. The energies involved are minuscule in these accelerators, and therefore the regions over which you would create any kind of conditions that are comparable to the early universe are so small, and the energy is so small that they're irrelevant. The thing about our Big Bang was that the earliest moments of the Big Bang, and it is amazing but true, all of the mass and energy in our entire visible universe was contained in a region smaller than a baseball. Okay, everything, all the mass and all the stars and galaxies.
You do understand, don't you? The average person really has a hard time with this.
Of course.
But what about origins? The dominant and virtually unchallenged myth of our origin is either that God created us in 7 days along with all the rest of creation, or that the universe was born out of nothingness in a single moment for no reason. These are the two choices on the menu. Neither terribly compelling to rationalists, I dare say. Interesting to note that this scientific explanation, the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant, however we may think of it in terms of its veracity, notice that it's the limit case for credulity. You understand what I mean? I mean that if you can believe that, hell, you can believe anything. Sit down and try and think of something more improbable than that contention. So it's like they open up with the 1-2 punch and say, put that in front of them. If they can swallow that, then, the hydrogen bond, gene segregation, and whatever will follow hard apace, because the hard swallow comes first. Well, now I maintain that it's a very odd place to look for. What that's called is a singularity. And many theories require a singularity. That means in order to kickstart the intellectual engine, you have to go outside the system and you get one free hypothesis. And then once you've used that up, your system has to run very, very smoothly, clear down to the end. So science uses up its one free hypothesis with the Big Bang, and it says, give me the first 10 to the minus high 12 nanoseconds, and if I can do smoke and mirrors in that, then the rest will proceed quite in an orderly fashion. Now that's orthodoxy, you got to understand. That's what the straight people believe. So I think that if you get one free singularity in your model building, a more likely place to put it would be not in a featureless, dimensionless, processless vacuum, super vacuum, it isn't even a vacuum, at the beginning, but why not look toward a domain of many temperature regimes, many forms of energy, many languages, many chemical systems, many different levels of energy exchange. In other words, why not look for the singularity late in the life of the universe instead of in the immediate moments of its birth? Then what you have is a picture not of a process being pushed by causality toward some heat death billions of years in the future, but what you get is a picture of a universe that is flowing naturally toward a dwell point or a low point in the energy landscape that's at the end. That organization transcends itself, produces more complex organization, which transcends itself, which produces more complex organization, and conceivably, out of a process of avalanching complexity like that, you might actually get a singularity of some sort. And this singularity would have the character of an attractor. Now, I grant you that it's irrational, but our little discussion of the birth of the universe should convince you that it's all irrational. That doesn't get you tossed out of the game. That's the name of the game.
And not just the average person, but everyone does. It's hard, it's impossible to imagine how you could compress everything we see into such a small region. And it amazes me when I think about it. In fact, my book Atom, in a sense, was a way to try and personalize that, because it's a history of an individual oxygen atom in a glass of water that you're drinking tonight. A history of that atom from the beginning of the universe to the end. And I tried to sort of personalize it and make that atom the hero, because it's very hard in an abstract sense to try and imagine those configurations. But
are there words you could give us that would attempt to describe how something the size of a baseball becomes all that is and can be seen?
Well, I can. We can try and follow it back step by step and see what happens. I mean, the configurations you have to achieve are kind of amazing. For example, if you took the mass of our sun and compressed it down to the size of Manhattan. Okay, then you could show that just a teaspoonful of material will weigh about 100 billion tons. Okay, and you might say, that's just crazy. I can never imagine doing that. But nature does it all the time. When stars explode, the inside of a star the size of our sun collapses into an object the size of Manhattan in a period of a second, and we see it. When a star explodes and forms a supernova explosion, it happens about once every 100 years per galaxy.
Right.
But we see it. The inside of the star collapses to form something called a neutron star, which is so dense that all of the atomic nuclei in all of the atoms in that star are actually touching. And the whole star collapses from the size of larger than the Earth to the size of Manhattan in a second. And what's amazing is we can see it happen.
All right, but you've still got a long way to go.
Exactly. We've still got a long way to go before we work backwards. But let me say why we believe this fantastical story, why it's not science fiction. The point is, if we assume the early universe was in that kind of crazy, intense, hot, very dense configuration,
yes,
then we can use the known laws of physics as we explore them in elementary particle physics accelerators and at nuclear reactors, etc., to try and predict what we would see. And the amazing thing is we can say, well, when the universe was 1 second old, it had a temperature of about 10 billion degrees, if this idea is correct.
Right.
And that happens to be at a temperature where nuclear reactions will take place. We can actually calculate it. If you start out with this hot, dense configuration with quarks and protons and electrons and all flying around, and then let it cool down to 10 billion degrees, how much, as nuclear reactions happen, how much of the light elements would be produced, starting out with hydrogen and then helium and then lithium, etc.
Right.
And the amazing thing is we predict, on the basis of things we measure in the laboratory, we predict that roughly 25% of the universe should end up as helium, whereas only 1 part in 10 billion or so of the universe should be lithium, the next lightest element. when we go out and measure with telescopes the abundance of light elements in the universe, what do we find? 25% of the universe is helium. 1 part in 10 to the 10th is lithium.
Okay.
Predictions that vary by 10 orders of magnitude are bang on with observations.
Okay.
We also predict there should be a hot afterglow of the Big Bang.
There
in 1965, it was discovered in, of all places, New Jersey.
Right.
And every single prediction we can make on the basis of that idea is an agreement, an exact agreement, with every observation we make about the universe. And so, therefore, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck.
Well,
I mean, and you could say, well, maybe it's not. And the point is, one of the biggest misconceptions about science is that people think science can prove something to be true. It can't. It can only prove something to be false. And it's false if it disagrees with experiments. There could even if a theory agrees with every observation you can make, there could always be a new observation down the line that would require you to revise your theory somewhat. It wouldn't make it wrong. Newton's laws are not wrong. They still apply today just like they were when Newton developed them. But at the extremes of scale and extremes of speed, we've had to revise them a little bit. Einstein had to revise them at one scale and quantum mechanics at another.
Let's say that you physicists, theoretical physicists, can get us back to a baseball and to 1 second after the bang, about the temperatures and everything. But then just leaping across that 1 second, then you get like to the God second, don't you?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Or do you? In other words, is there a point where you say, sorry, this doesn't have explanation?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what makes science interesting. We don't understand everything. And so we fully know that the laws of physics as we now understand them cannot be applied before a certain time.
They began at that instant. The present laws of physics began at that instant. But
well, they began at that instant, but we don't know. In fact, we don't even know if they began at that instant. We know that they break down. They begin to make predictions that are nonsensical before a certain time, and we know that we'll need some new theory that will allow us to extrapolate back earlier. So we have many ideas of what that theory might be and what the predictions might be, but we really don't know.
Would you want to give me your best guesses?
Well, one thing that I think is quite reasonable, although it sounds like a cop-out, and here I agree with my friend Stephen Hawking, that if you ask sort of what happened before the Big Bang,
yes,
the answer is that's not a good question. Because what general relativity tells us is that space and time are tied together, and they're tied together with matter.
Well, that's not a good question for you.
Oh, yeah, no, hold on. Okay, yeah, exactly. But the point is, when things get very, very dense, it could be that what we mean by time, the whole notion of time breaks down. And time itself may have begun in the Big Bang. And so there was no sense of time before the Big Bang.
Well, how could there be? Must there not be two objects with relative velocity to each other to have the beginning of measurement? So if there was nothing, there could not be time.
Well, no. You see, the problem is let's step back and think. What does it mean to have relative velocity? That means they're moving apart in space, right?
Well, how do we measure time? The way the sun goes around, the Earth goes around the sun, rather, or the moon goes around the Earth, or whatever.
Motion is the way we measure it. Exactly. Yes. But motion requires moving through space.
Yes.
But it could be at very, very earliest instance when all of the mass of the universe was in a region smaller than the size of an atom, that space itself, the concept of space itself breaks down. It's not a good quantity. We don't know. We know that if we take the classical notions of space and time and try and apply them back then you get nonsensical predictions. And so it could just be that a better theory of space and time would give us better predictions. Or it could be that space and time themselves actually grew out of the Big Bang. And therefore, the classical notions that we use to describe the reality we experience don't apply back then. Just like at quantum mechanical level, just like at the level of individual atoms, many of the classical notions that are associated with motions of a baseball and when a batter hits it don't apply anymore when you're talking about electrons and atoms. We've had to learn that, our myopia, our cosmic myopia is revised. It's one of the greatest things about science. It forces us to realize that the way we view the world and what we think is sensible need not always be right.
Well, Professor, do you contemplate the probability of a giant nothingness prior to that instant, a giant waiting theater for the paints to be applied?
Well, actually, my favorite picture is probably that, in fact, that our visible universe is really just part of what might be called a multiverse, where there are regions where there are big bangs happening right now, an infinite universe where there are big bangs happening, there are big crunches, their universe is collapsing down to singularities, and in these multiverse, we happen to live in an infinite region, by the way, an infinitely large region, which happened to have a big bang 12 to 15 billion years ago. But there are other regions of this multiverse that are just now experiencing big bang, and I think that the laws of physics, we understand them, suggest that that's the most likely possibility. But really, right now, we're talking about metaphysics.
Well, while we're on the subject of multiverse, let's consider time travel and that nasty problem with Grandma. Well, in a multiverse, we go back and we kill Grandma, and in one timeline, in one universe, you pop out of existence as Grandma dies. Now, in the other instantly created universe, it's a different story altogether.
You're right. I mean, that has been proposed as one of the ways around this paradox.
Is it, do you think?
Well, it's nice words. The problem is, as far as I know, there's no physics behind it. I mean, for example, we know, people talk about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, that when you go back and, that whenever you measure something, you sort of have a lot of different levels of reality, and it's all nice words. But one of the things that is important about quantum mechanics is it never allows you to jump from one to the other. So it's one possibility, but right now there's no concrete physics that allows for such a possibility. And therefore, it's a nice idea, but there's no basis to that idea. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but right now it's just talk. Okay?
Oh, okay. Well, then let's say we take our little stroll through the wormhole, and we do, in fact, kill Grandma. Then that's a big problem, then.
It is a big problem. And here's another, it is a big problem, but people have come up with another solution.
And that
is that you're doomed to repeat the events of the past. Namely, that, say you want to go back in time and kill Hitler, okay?
Yes.
Before he, did all his things. Yeah. Well, you go back in a wormhole, you do it, but just when you're about to pull the trigger, you trip, okay?
Yeah.
And that you're doomed, that the laws of physics are such that whenever you go back in time, you cannot change the future.